Good morning. Last week I concluded our study on the book of Ecclesiastes. We finished with Solomon's famous line, "Fear God and keep his commandments." And Solomon's teaching in Ecclesiastes does lead us back to the fact that a life without God is meaningless, but life with God is eternal. We ended up learning a lot more during the study of Ecclesiastes. But today I want to look and introduce our next Sunday School series. I've got to do it with a quick overview of a biblical book as background and look at the lives of two people because these two people play an intricate part of our study. And these two people are the prophet Solomon and the first king of Israel, Saul. So bear with me a little bit because I'm really doing a fast summary of about 15 chapters of the first book of Samuel. So who is Samuel? Samuel's actually the last judge over Israel, and this is around 1100 BC. He was the 15th judge. He descended from the tribe of Levi, and his mother's name was Hannah, and she named her child Samuel, which means besought from God. So when Samuel was 3, Hannah took him to Shiloh and dedicated him to the worship of God. She gave Samuel over to the care of the high priest Eli, who was the judge over Israel at the time. When Eli died, then Samuel became the judge of Israel. And during Samuel's time as judge, Israel thrived. But as Samuel grows older, he appoints his sons as judges, but Israel really didn't like that too much. His sons didn't walk in the ways of Samuel. Plus, Israel in general had already been sliding downhill, and the people were disillusioned. The people decided they're tired of worshiping this invisible God, and they just wanted to be like other countries around them. They wanted a king. And this all happens in the middle of the first book of Samuel. So the people choose a king, and my first question is, what kind of person do you think the people would choose to be king? Think about it. Well, of course, they charge the same kind of person that we would pick today. Tall, dark, handsome, and around 40-ish. A person from the prominent tribe, a good upper crust guy, a guy from the tribe of Benjamin, and a guy who was pretty good at making battles and being in war because this is a time of instability, so they want a leader who's well qualified to wage war against some of Israel's enemies. So Saul seemed to be the right guy, at least to the people. But it didn't take long, and Saul became moody, hot-tempered, thin-skinned, and subject to whole seasons of depression. And Saul's real problem was Saul was trusting in himself, and he wasn't trusting in God. And this all culminates in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, where Saul is taking the people of Israel into battle against the Amalekites. Saul wins the battle. He kills all the women and children and livestock, but he leaves alive the king and the best livestock. The problem is Saul has been told to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And this is also the principle that God had given the Israelites in Deuteronomy when they were taking on the promised land. So in 1 Samuel 13, Samuel informs Saul that, "Saul, you have acted foolishly, but now your kingdom shall not endure, for God has picked a man after God's own heart." That's a famous description for the type of people that God chooses, right? God chooses by looking at the inside, at the heart. God says, in a lot of ways, I pick a nobody and turn him into somebody. And this is basically where we're going to start our study. Because of course we're going to study the life of David, the son of Jesse, a man from the tribe of Judah, who was a nobody. Samuel heads to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem, and he's been told that the next king is in Jesse's house, and God will show him a man after God's own heart. And who is David? David is nothing impressive. In fact, his father Jesse doesn't even bring him before Samuel. David's been out in the fields being a shepherd boy. He's maybe 10, 12, maybe 15 at the max, a pre-adolescent boy like any other boy in Bethlehem, ruddy in complexion, with beautiful eyes, but nothing about David's outward appearance set him apart. He was just a plain old shepherd boy. But God had scanned Israel looking for a leader, and he says, there he is. There's a man after my own heart. God is looking not for perfect people, but he's looking for people who have a heart for him. You might want to pause the video and write down some other qualities that God would be looking for in leaders. We do know that God sought a man after his own heart. And what does that phrase mean? It means people that are seeking to live in harmony with God. Those who are seeking to live under God's canopy of rules. Someone who is seeking God's approval, not man's approval. This doesn't mean the person was perfect. Certainly doesn't mean that they didn't sin. It means that they have a heart toward doing things God's way instead of our way. We're going to use the word spirituality. David had just a certain spirituality about him, where he had a heart for God. But make sure when I use that word that we're talking about God's spirituality. We're not talking about a man-made spirituality, an Eastern spirituality, a like Dalai Lama type of spirituality. We're talking about a God-focused spirituality. The second character we look at is humility. God is looking for servant leaders who are humble. God looked at David out in the fields, doing his father's bidding, tending sheep. Samuel comes to the house. Jesse calls the older brothers. They've often been making a name for themselves. David's been alone tending a few sheep. There's no glory in keeping sheep. But God's servants don't care about getting glory. God's servants just worry about getting the job done. David is humble. Another modern word for this is David is authentic. God is looking deeper. He's looking at the heart. He's looking for humble servants. And finally, God's looking for integrity. The Hebrew word is thaman, T-H-A-M-A-M, and the word's been translated a number of different ways. It's been translated complete, whole, innocent, wholesome, sound. An English idiom for what God is looking for is somebody that's just honest to the core. We'll use the word integrity. Integrity is what you are when no one's looking. Integrity is bone deep honesty. Now here's something for you young people who are listening. The world teaches make a good first impression. But that's not enough. I learned long ago when I was interviewing people that the interviewee is trying to impress me and make a good impression. My job is to go beyond that first impression and try to find out those qualities that really matter. Young people, any of us old people will tell you, externals are not enough. Focus on developing your internal qualities, your inner qualities. These are the qualities that really matter. So there we have it. God is looking for spirituality, humility, and integrity. The next question I want you to think about is, how did God prepare David? What was the training process that God used? And in particular, how did God train David for his big moment? We all know the big moment, right? The big moment is when David is staring at Goliath. Everybody knows the story. It's one of the first stories of the Old Testament that were ever taught. But have you ever thought about it? How did God prepare David for that moment? It might be a good time to pause the video and think about that. In this regard, I will close today's teaching by looking at how God prepared David for the big moment. God's training ground for David was lonely, obscure, monotonous, but real. That's right, Christian. Lonely, obscure, monotonous, and real. That is where the training took place. And the training often takes place in unlikely places, in unlikely ways. So how did God train David? Well, first, God trained David out in the shepherd fields, out and around Bethlehem, in solitude. David had learned some life lessons out there in those fields, alone. He had felt the winds of autumn, the cold rain of winter, the burning rays of summer sun, and nights alone under the stars. This is where David learned to be a king. This is where he learned to king it. Also, David grew up in obscurity. He was the youngest of like 7 boys. And what it's like to be the youngest. Does anyone in the family even know you exist? Certainly, even David's own father treated him like a nobody, right? Samuel comes to the house and Jesse doesn't even call him. God often trains his leaders in obscurity. Many servant leaders are first unknown, unseen, unappreciated, and unapplauded. There's also a lot of monotony in training. It's just dull life, day after day, faithful to a routine, unexciting daily tasks, constant, unchanging, endless hours of monotony. That's what it's like to be a shepherd boy, and often that is what it's like to learn at the feet of God. But there's one other quality of training with God. Because if you think of those first 3 things, you kind of get the idea of a monk's training, or like an Eastern mystic. But training with God does have another aspect. Training with God is done by living each day of your life in training in real life. There's a realness, a reality. We all know David's big moment. How did he have the courage for that moment? Do you remember how it went down? David says, "Hey, let's go whip the giant." And Saul says, "You? Why do you have such boldness?" David says, "I have been with my father's sheep." Saul says, "You're just a kid. You can't go fight the giant." And then what does David famously say? Go to 1 Samuel 17, verse 34 and 35. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him." Where does David get all that courage? He gets it all alone before God. Yes, David is a boy, but he is a boy who has learned courage out there in the fields tending sheep. He got his courage by being faithful in his job as a shepherd boy. Goliath is no big deal when you've been out there killing lions and bears. So it's not that David was out there learning some lessons in the wilderness. David is doing his boring little job, but he's letting God lead him and having God help him tackle life's challenges. David learns to king it by living life before God on a day in and day out basis. And in David's case, he learns how to be a king by wrestling and caring for his sheep. So we have two lasting lessons. Number one is we prove ourselves in little things and in lonely places. The test of a person is in the preparation before the big events. Number two is that when God develops our inner qualities, He is never in a hurry. The conversion of a soul, Christian, is a miracle of a moment, but the dynamic of making a leader is the task of a lifetime. When God develops character, He works on it in solitude and obscurity throughout our lifetime. The schoolmaster of monotony and reality is where we're going to learn to king it. And God is never in a hurry, Christian. So let me close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time, for this teaching. Thank you for the life of David, who is a man after God's own heart. In your name, amen.